everybody. For those of you who saw my video on Warren Buffett and his thoughts on gold, I have some additional information on that. I found an article, I can't remember who wrote it, I'll put the link below. It's showing two graphs. One of them showing you what his company Berkshire Hathaway has done in terms of gold as opposed to in terms of paper monopoly money. And it's actually, over the last 15 years, I think it is, hasn't moved. Since about 1995, it's right back where it was 17 years ago. So that's pretty incredible. And the other graph shows what Coca-Cola company has done against sugar and gold. And even with Coke's 1.6% dividend each year, doesn't compare to gold. In regards to my video on interest rates, there was a comment that I had. At least one person was trying to debunk the video by saying that not all that 15.5 trillion turns over, when we see higher rates. If you have a 30-year treasury bond, then 30 years is the length of that interest rate. Well, what I failed to mention in that video is that a lot of the U.S. debt is now short-term debt. Under the Clinton administration, they figured out that the U.S. could considerably reduce borrowing costs by, changing all the longer-term debt into short-term debt and having lower interest rates. And Bush and the Obama administration have followed suit. So these days, we're constantly adding huge amounts of debt that's maturing a lot faster than it used to. It has to be rolled over all the time. A good example of this is what Michael Pinto was saying on King World News blog today. I guess they interviewed him recently and they had a blog entry. He was saying that commercial banks have purchased $78 billion in treasury and agency debt in the first 2 months of 2012. So that's a good example of short-term debt. They're buying up huge amounts of short-term debt. And by doing this, the Fed can monetize the existing and newly issued treasury debt. Because if you remember, in 2009, the Fed started paying interest on money held at the Federal Reserve by the commercial banks. Because if the commercial banks were to use fractional reserve lending with all the trillions of dollars have been printed up, inflation would just be unthinkable. So they're holding a lot of that money at the Federal Reserve. Well, now they figured out a way, because Bernanke said he'd hold rates down near zero for the next 3 years. Well, so they can make a 3-year note at over 0.5% and buy treasury bills. So that's a lot of short-term debt that's being created there by the banks. And like James Turk also recently said, we're gonna have, he sees the biggest transfer of wealth in the history of the world. And in order to combat this inflation that's going to be here, because they can't raise rates so high like they did in the 70s, you got to hold real money. You got to hold gold and silver, as the paper just keeps getting inflated. And so to participate in the greatest wealth transfer in the history of the world, like Mike Maloney also talks about, you got to have gold and silver. Talk to you all soon.